Well, we've reached the conclusion of the Pope's apostolic visit, or at least we're getting there. It's the weekend, and the Holy Father has made it to Philadelphia, and he will conclude his visit tomorrow. This is really the main reason that he came. The World Meeting of Families, which is taking place in Philadelphia, is going to end tomorrow with a Mass that he's going to celebrate, and then he's on his way back to Rome. But maybe just three quick thoughts for us today as we reflect upon this visit. I had a chance to run into a guy yesterday who's a tremendous man, deep faith, very knowledgeable, and he asked me really quickly, "Hey, so what do you think of this Pope?" And I said, "Well, have you actually read the Pope, or are you just reading headlines?" He says, "No, I really haven't had a chance to read much of them. I'm really kind of turned off by what I see in the press." I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "You've never read him?" "Uh-uh." "Well, then you have to read him." He says, "Why is that?" I says, "Because you probably have the image that he's come to talk about climate change, but he's come to talk about Jesus." And he looks at me and he says, "He has?" I said, "Yeah." Because he's mentioned Jesus? "Yeah, every time, all the time. It's always talking about is Jesus." Wow, thanks. I had no idea. I share that simply because this is a very intelligent man who loves God greatly, who, for whatever reason, and I think it's just because media often, not always, but often tends to latch on to things that are going to fit their own agenda, they haven't exactly portrayed this man who is the successor of St. Peter and a deep friend of Jesus Christ. And so I want to encourage us today to look at three things that the Holy Father has written, because there's no better way to understand this man than to actually read him. Now, one of these is long. It's somewhat long anyway. It's this document that came out last year called The Joy of the Gospel, or in Latin, it's Evangelii Gaudium. This might be, in my very humble estimation, one of the most significant documents that the Church has published in 100 years. It's the playbook, if you will, for the Catholic Church in the work of evangelization. It lays out Francis's vision for us becoming what he calls missionary disciples, going out into the world, just like we're seeing him in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C., in New York, just embodying the joy of somebody who has encountered Jesus and trying to attract people who have mistakenly thought the gospel is ordinary news back to the extraordinary news that is the gospel, namely the message that you and I are far, far, far more important than we had ever dared to imagine or to dream, because we're loved by God beyond all telling. So I can't encourage us enough to read The Joy of the Gospel. A second thing that would be very worth reading is an address. It's short, it's very short, and it's like a synthesis of the playbook, if you will, that Pope Francis gave to the bishops of Brazil when he was down in Rio for the World Youth Day gathering. And it took place, you can search this easily online, July 28th, 2013. And he uses the image of Jesus meeting the two travelers on their way to Emmaus on Easter Sunday who have not yet heard the gospel, or rather they have not yet heard the news that Jesus is risen. Actually, they have heard it. They just don't believe it. And Francis uses this as something like an image for us as we're walking with the world who has walked away from Jerusalem. He uses that as an image of walking away from the gospel. And he simply asks the question, do we have what it takes to warm people's hearts again, the way Jesus did with these two travelers who are on their way away from Jerusalem and on their way back to ordinary life? It's a really rich document and very challenging and very hopeful. And the last thing that I would encourage us to read is his address to the bishops that took place here in Washington, D.C. earlier this week. Again, very easy to find online because whenever he speaks to the bishops, it's something like the inner heart of Francis revealed for those who are his closest collaborators with him in showing forth the gospel that he's trying to communicate to the world. I think, as I've been watching him and as I'm hearing people talk about this visit, what we're seeing again and again is the joy of Jesus, the joy of somebody who has met Jesus, who firmly believes that it's the greatest gift that anybody can receive. He's attracting people, he's provoking people, he's leading people who perhaps have thought, I didn't know that there was anything relevant in Christianity for today's world, to ask the question, well, maybe there is. That might be annoying for some of us who, again, just keep wanting him to hammer issues, but the issue for Francis isn't any particular doctrine or teaching, as important as all of those are. The issue for Francis is whether or not you and I have met Jesus. If we have, then we can't stop talking about him. If we haven't, let's pray today that we'll meet him.